Welcome to the Changeover Podcast, hosted by Weidert Group, an industrial marketing and sales growth agency. It's our mission to give sales and marketing teams at industrial organizations the fuel they need to grow and prosper within today's changing landscape. I'm your host, Greg Linneman-Stuns. In this episode, we're talking about the role of the website with Kelly Wilhelm, our Director of Marketing. You'll learn how the fragmented nature of today's buyer journeys is affecting website traffic and how you can adapt your site accordingly. Let's get started. Joining me today is a coworker of mine, Kelly Wilhelm. She's been the Director of Marketing for Weidert Group. She's been with us going on 9 years now, and she is the absolute owner of our website. And so we thought it'd be great if we brought her on and she could share with all of us the perspectives that have changed over the years on what we can expect a company's website to do for it. So, Kelly, just a little bit of a introduction on your background. How long have you been working on different enterprise websites?
Most of my website work started when I came to Weidert Group. Before that, I was more financial communications, internal HR type communications. But quick learning curve. And at the time I joined, it was 2015, like you said, 9 years ago. And inbound was sort of just starting to take off with that hockey stick of growth. And so as long as you built a website that was, technically sound from a SEO and development standpoint, and you had good, helpful, relevant content, you could expect some good things. Yeah. And it's a little bit different today.
Yeah. We've often joked about how in the early days of the web that people were putting up digital brochures. That's really what they had back then. And as we rolled into inbound, that it became your 24/7, 365-day sales agent for you. That it attracted, it converted, it really helped us do inbound selling. And so as you look today, what are the changes that you're seeing versus where we were, well, as you said, 9 years ago when you became part of an inbound partner?
Most websites were, not even all companies had one, right? Until the late 2000s. And especially in industrials, they typically very hands-on sales process. So they may not have thought of their website very much and may have just thought of it as a static, like you said, digital brochure that's all about the company, right? And then more around the 2010s, we got into inbound was taking off, like we said, and if you published helpful, relevant content that showed your expertise and authority and trustworthiness, and that's what Google's looking for, and you're gonna rank for and hopefully attract some traffic from qualified personas. And so I think what we're dealing with today is, like you said, buyer behaviors have changed. We're really dealing with a fragmented traffic landscape, like top of the funnel landscape. Can
you talk more about that when you talk about a fragmented buyer landscape? What's driving that, and what are we seeing? How's it manifested?
Yeah, when I say that, I think of what we would think of as the top of the funnel in marketing and sales. The website in the past has been a fairly full funnel asset. And so you could expect your website to perform and drive a good portion of that top to middle of the funnel activity of attracting qualified traffic who could fill out a form, based on a landing page, an ebook you might have offered. And they may have actually even found that ebook like landing page on their own, through backlinks or a number of SEO tactics. And they'd fill out that form, and now you've got a lead in your CRM. And we talk a lot about HubSpot and the power of a unified data system. And when we say the fragmenting of the landscape, I think about the top of the funnel buyer behavior. And in the past, they may have had a query that they'd go out to Google and search, or Bing or whatever, probably Google, but they'd go out to Google and search, and it was very awareness-driven keywords that inbound marketers were going after, that were targeted with helpful educational content meant to attract that person doing the research, the person who fits your target personas, to land on your website, right? Like, so we would sometimes in the early days target very tangential keywords, right? Like, we know that marketers and salespeople may struggle with using PowerPoint. And so we may have written a nifty little, 10 tips that you didn't know about PowerPoint, like PowerPoint hacks, right?
Yeah,
Super top of the funnel. It's like even before the top of the funnel, it's a tangential keyword, and it's a brand awareness.
It has nothing to do with our ICP, really.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Like, you want to get them to your site because you know that the human behind that search is likely to be one of your target personas. And so it's a very brand awareness play. I think this may be a bold statement for some people, but you can't expect your website necessarily anymore to help you get the word out about your company. So what the website today is becoming is more of a welcome mat for visitors, and you still have the opportunity to show and be a very helpful, empathetic guide to those visitors once they land on your site. But the way that they're getting there and the point at which they are in their buying journey and buyer research behavior is likely much more middle to even bottom of the funnel than it has been in the past.
Can you just speak to what happened to the top of the funnel? Why aren't those visitors coming who used to be looking for how do I build a PowerPoint? Stuff that had nothing to do with the ICP, but it was good for traffic.
Yeah. Well, you think like 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago, think how much less noise there was on the internet. Like, before content creators and before brands started thinking like publishers, there was just a lot less competition. And I think now, it's like any evolution of marketing changes and buyers change and they tune out the noise. Inbound has become much more commonplace. Yeah. And so a lot of these keywords have just become impossible to rank for, partly because of the crowding, but partly because Google's algorithms have changed. And so you used to be able to get pretty far with organic and paid tactics, and now Google's changed the game, and AI has changed the game.
Certainly that's had an enormous impact on buyer behavior, because now AI will answer so many of these questions that we used to use and lots of marketers used to use to get top of the funnel, and it wasn't quality traffic.
Yeah.
But back in the day, it was traffic.
If you think about KPIs of the relationship between organic traffic and even a paid component of traffic related to those same keywords, and a percentage of that would become fill out forms and become subscribers or contacts, and then a percentage of those would fit your ICP and become a marketing qualified lead, and so there was a fairly linear relationship where you could figure out some conversion rates and sort of have some predictability to your top of the funnel and your lead generation. But we actually, we'll dive deep into SEO coming up in an episode with Chelsea from our team, who's our SEO strategist, and she's going to unpack that a lot more. So I won't get into it too much, but basically there's 3 reasons really for the fragmenting and the changing and why that's not working anymore. It's, in my mind, the fragmentation, and then the changing buyer behaviors, user behaviors, like they're not filling out forms anymore, which I'll talk a little bit more about, and how, what do you do then, right? Yeah. And also, I think user experience confusion is another piece of it that we haven't talked a lot about, but Chelsea and I have talked about that too. Like, offline, it's just, we as content creators and thinking like publishers, like, it was great. It worked for a decade.
Years, yeah.
But if you think about how you would use that content, like in terms of your website and navigating users through your website, we sometimes created confusion for the user, and we didn't have very linear paths for them to follow, because the goal was get them on our site and then give them something so that they convert, right? And we weren't targeting very, very narrow keywords. So getting them on the site, it was sort of like, just get them to convert on anything, right? Yeah. And so we created this confusion, and they'd land on a page, and we'd provide them CTAs to go to more blogs or more landing pages or an ebook or whatever it was. And so we'll talk more about like how you really need to refine your user experience on your site and have the shortest path possible between SEO and UX, right? Yeah, like the shortest path between what was that high intent keyword that we're targeting now, more middle bottom of the funnel keyword, and then making it just very easy for them to raise their hand on your site, making it very relevant. Like they're just, like I said, being an empathetic guide to that visitor once they get to your page, making yourself credible and transparent and accessible right away.
So in general, what you're saying is, forget about the masses. Yeah. Focus completely on the ICP, and then within that, focus on where they are in the journey. That we're really looking at buyer intent behavior that tells us, these people are they're at the point where they're kicking tires, they're looking at product, they're thinking about very specific solutions, and so we want both the content and the journey, or the path, to be as welcoming to them specifically as it possibly can be. Is that?
Yeah, that's fair, especially from when you think about like narrowing your keyword strategy, which I think that episode is live. So go listen to that after this, and you can hear Chelsea unpack that component of attraction, the SEO component. She'll dive really deep into how you do that, right? Like what's her advice on finding those relevant keywords, and what kind of content do you create that will help you rank for those keywords. In a nutshell, you're not going to be able to use your website necessarily to help you get the word out about your brand anymore. So it's not so much a brand awareness play anymore. Because of the fragmented landscape, your brand awareness plays are going to be very steeped in audience research, and they're going to be very diverse compared to trying to just attract people to your website. Yeah. It's going to be very bespoke depending on your audience and the intelligence you have on your audience. We talk about like, why don't those educational queries work anymore? Why aren't people getting to your website? In large part, it is because of AI, because AI overviews, or people aren't even using Google for those queries. They're using ChatGPT and other LLMs and Claude, and pick your favorite. So there's a portion of those searches that just aren't even happening on Google anymore. And then people, because of the noise that I mentioned, are finding very like niche communities, that they want to be a part of on Slack or on Discord or Reddit. Reddit's a whole nother topic too. Yeah. But the point is that they're not that top of the funnel. And so all the more reason that if you're thinking about brand awareness and what does that mean? What do I do now to get the word out about my company? It's got to be very based in audience intelligence, which there is data like SparkToro and some platforms that can help you with that. But it's also very much like voice of the customer, talking to your salespeople, going back to those other ways that you can gather data to help you build those brand awareness plays. So we're not going to spend the rest of the episode talking about that. There's too much to unpack there. But I think just when you're thinking about the role of your website, you've got to acknowledge that that people are generally going to be brand aware much more than they used to be by the time they hit your website. Because in a lot of cases, Googling you is the last thing they did before they filled out a form to contact you.
But isn't it more about that we've eliminated that part of visitors who were not very aware when they showed up?
And in large part, we don't care.
Right.
We don't care that we eliminated them.
Right.
Because they never had any intent anyway.
Yeah. And so vanity metrics don't matter. Engagement matters.
Yeah.
And the well-intentioned visitor who's ready to become a buyer. That matters, and we know that.
Yeah. Yeah, and there is, like I said, there's definitely still an organic component, especially for some industrials. There are probably more pockets still within industrial than most other spaces that haven't been, that don't have as stiff of a competition as a like a marketing agency. We have pretty stiff competition, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So there are still pockets, and there is still a purpose for SEO, which Chelsea will dive into. One of the things that I love about how the role of a website has changed is because the keyword, focus is much more buyer intent, it's much more narrow. Like, I don't have to focus on the blog machine anymore.
So
I don't have to create content that feeds the engine constantly.
Yeah, so let's go there. Where, if you're starting the process of creating the next generation website,
which we are.
So Kelly, from a strategy perspective, if we're embarking on a website development project, what are the most important considerations to yield a highly functioning website in today's world?
Yeah, I think this strategy is super important. We had a whole panel talk about that at our Experience Inbound event in a couple months ago from our team, and it was fascinating, like seeing the different perspectives from UX versus SEO versus design. But the biggest thing that overarched all of those components was strategy. And so we've talked a little bit about, keyword strategy and how you narrow your focus to high intent keywords. Yeah. Well, how do you find out what those are? We talked about audience intelligence, is important to those. But even stepping back from that, what did we do before we did the keyword research? We built a strategic canvas about the agency's growth. Yeah. We also did our messaging and positioning, right? Yes. Which is huge. That's where I was going. We spent a lot of time arguing, right?
Yeah. Which wasn't
good way arguing.
Which wasn't using any sort of landscape tool or keyword research tool. It was using strategic judgment.
Yeah, and looking at our customer base and figuring out who do we want more of, who really is our ideal customer profile, and not even just from a demographics, but from a psychographic standpoint, right? Right. And so I think it starts like so much farther, up the strategy conversation. If you start with your ICP and then you really, really nail your messaging and positioning, and you use that as your guiding light for everything you're doing on the website. I've gone back to that so many times in thinking about, okay, well, what are the pain points? What are the challenges that our personas within our ICP companies are really, really looking to solve? And how can we best show that we're an empathetic guide and that we want to help them from the second they hit the website? I think it was Rand Fishkin who I heard say recently in some form, read or heard, that you've got to have a really short distance between SEO and UX today. And I thought that was a really great way to think about it, because it ties together so many things, right? In that one little statement, it ties together the idea of your keyword, like intent keyword strategy with audience intelligence. And really what it means is that if they're coming from, really whatever source they're coming from, but particularly if they're coming from organic, that you've targeted that high intent keyword, and then when they get to your site, you've got a very clean navigation, very clean site architecture, compelling bottom of the funnel offers.
I see exactly what you're saying, Kelly. Yeah. That those two have got to be joined at the hip. That if that's the keyword that's getting them there, then this should be their UX.
Yeah, and make it very apparent. And so, like I said before, we sort of caused this confusion in trying to drive them to top of the funnel content and things. And now it's like with our own new site and with client sites we've worked on, we've tried to get like very focused on conversion paths and what's the content that's worth creating, because there is opportunity there and there is intent there.
So content isn't the attraction agent that it was. So what's the most important content then that you really got to think about for your site, given that we're really hyper focused on where the visitor is in their journey?
Yeah, and content, I think at the top of the funnel, it's not that it goes away. It just takes different form, right? Like it depends if you're doing a thought leadership strategy and you need lots of micro content by actual humans, not your brand, things like that. So content still exists in it. Just it looks different than it used to. So in the past, instead of driving them to a landing page where they'd fill out a form for gated content really is not performing well. People are not filling out forms because, like we said, they can get those answers elsewhere for free. And so you've got to think about what is worth gating or putting behind a form. And it's probably going to be very, very bottom of the funnel things or very human connection focused things. So think about yourself. Like the last form that you filled out for something was probably, I would bet you money, it's either for a live event, a webinar,
or something I was about to buy.
Right, because you're raising your hand. Yeah, that was the next thing I was going to say. Or it's a very, very relevant bottom of the funnel. That's going to get me to raise my hand. So like for industrials, it might be something like a design for manufacturability assessment or something that's just really relevant to that.
Relevant and valuable. Yeah,
relevant and valuable, and that lends itself to human connection, because at the end of the day, that's what you're trying to get. You're trying to get a connection with a lead, which is a human.
If you were summarizing, what's the advice that you give to industrial marketers to make sure they're thinking about if they're moving toward a new website?
Well, first I'd say don't panic, because it's not like everything you've known about your website needs to go out the window. That's not what we're saying.
It's not all broken.
Right. No, it's not all broken. At the end of the day, why you have a website, right, today is to communicate your brand's credibility and accessibility. And that's still true. It's just the way you go about getting people there is quite different than it used to. And so you have to acknowledge that with what you have on your website. Like, you're not going to have all that top of the funnel educational content necessarily anymore.
Right.
So it is still about focusing on your buyer and their pain points. That's not changing, and it's even more important now than it ever was before. It's also having good, clean UX navigation, simple conversion forms for things that make sense to be behind a form.
Ungating the stuff that doesn't need to be behind a gate anymore.
Yeah, because it's not doing anything for you behind a gate.
Right.
It's if it's a PDF, it's really not getting crawled by Google. And if it's something that that an AI can answer, I would say do a good content audit and either decide what you're gonna. I always say kill, keep, or improve. Based on the metrics. So that's a really good step. If you're feeling overwhelmed, like I have all these pages that aren't doing well, and my traffic's going down, and start by just culling your content, because I don't know this for sure. I don't think it was in the Google leak that came out, but I have had this hypothesis for a couple of years now that since Google last changed to the EEAT algorithm, that the average age of your content affects your rankings. If you've been a content creator for a long time and you have a lot of old stuff out there,
it is perishable.
That it's maybe dragging you down.
Yeah.
So I would say definitely do a content audit is number one, and then nailing that messaging and positioning, really speaking to your target personas and their pain points and their challenges that you can help solve.
So in some ways, the return of the basics really matters.
Yep. Yeah. That's why I say don't panic. Actually take a breath and realize that you don't have to keep churning out all this top of the funnel educational content.
There's something refreshing in that.
Yeah.
Well, great. Thank you, Kelly. Well, that's all for this episode of The Changeover, the podcast for industrial marketing and sales professionals. Please stay tuned. We're going to be recording next an episode on Does SEO Still Matter with our own Chelsea Drusch. And so we invite you and encourage you to take a listen there. I can't wait. It's going to be fascinating. In the meantime, please follow us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever it is you get your podcast. Visit Weidert.com/changeover podcast to get links to any of the resources that we mentioned in today's episode. And please let us know what you think, what you want to hear about next time, by messaging Weidert Group on social media. You can find me on LinkedIn and most of our group there. I'm Greg Linneman Sons. Thanks for listening.